The ancient Egyptians were ancient even to the ancients. But just because something is old doesn't mean it's necessarily good. What are some of the best ideas that came from ancient Egypt and the worst? And what lessons regarding power and politics from this era that we can learn that are still applicable to our modern situations? Hello, this is Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom, a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. You can now find us, along with our free newsletter, classicalwisdom.substack.com. Today's Classical Wisdom Speaks podcast is with Dr. Kara Cooney, professor of Egyptian art and architecture at UCLA. Kara specializes in craft production, coffin studies, and economies in the ancient world. Cooney produced a comparative archaeology television series entitled Out of Egypt, which aired in 2009 on the Discovery Channel and is available online via Netflix and Amazon. But before we get into ancient Egypt, a quick thank you for our Classical Wisdom Society members who make this podcast possible. If you would like to become a society member and help support the classics, please go to classicalwisdom.substack.com and subscribe. You can also help us out by subscribing to our podcast channel. Just hit that red button, subscribe, to get your monthly dose of the classics. Now, to go back to the era of the pharaohs. This is another thing where I find it's very interesting to compare our modern world to our ancient ancestors all over the world. And the idea we are experiencing right now, like we've just experienced a pandemic where, there's war, there's inequality. I mean, this is something that right now we have to handle and deal with and make peace with, maybe the things that are out of our control, or try to change the things that are in our control if you're a bit stoic. But how did the ancient Egyptians do that? How did they deal with those kind of universal issues?
Yeah, the Egyptians would look towards community leadership and community cohesion, and they still do. And I have never, if you believe that a place can be partially formed by their geography and their space in the world, this river unites rather than separates. If you look at the map of Greece, for instance, you can see that there is physical separation, that people are encouraged to consider themselves a person of this island or that island, or the mainland or the islands. There is not a lot of cohesion in this place. You can see it on the map in an instant. This is a competitive place. So when Hesiod says, build your house, do not ask for help, let your slave do it, you hold this fort on your own. And that's very un-Egyptian. Egyptians are bound together by their river, and that river, that artery of connection, it means you don't need urban spaces. You can have village after village after village connected by all the boats that people are able to make themselves out of the vegetation of this place. And even when things go south, and I study the Bronze Age collapse, which is probably one of the worst migratory movements, one of the worst climatic changes, one of the worst most devastating elite replacements in the ancient world. Invasion of the Sea Peoples, loss of an elite to the north, the shift of a king from the Ramessid family to a group of Libyan families, however you understand Libyans. There's massive shifts happening, and the Egyptians turn local, and they look to local power, and they find their way through with a lot of resilience and a continuance of the same culture, the same religion, the same language. I mean, it's an amazing thing that Arabic was able to get a foothold in Egypt at all. And the reason Arabic did in the first millennium is because the top 20% were all running their economic world in Arabic. And because there was an elite replacement, maybe 7% of elites were replaced, everyone else was like, oh my God, I need to get in on this. I need to learn this language, and I need to connect to this Arabic way of doing things. And so Egyptian was lost. But up until that point, Egyptian language, Egyptian religion, All of these things were the community glue that held everyone together. And I think it still is. Egypt, when people were getting upset with Mubarak in 2009, 2010, they did so en masse. They did so as a large group together, and they united even people from Muslim Brotherhood factions and far left democracy movement factions. And those people united and they marched in Tahrir Square. When Mohamed Morsi was voted in, it seems like the Egyptian people were all in favor of this vote, right? And then you get a couple of years later, and then all these people are in favor of getting rid of Mohamed Morsi. It's a very interesting place where communal agreement is manufactured and forged again and again. And the Nile itself could be the reason that Egypt so easily succumbs to elites pushing for authoritarian power. And most people having little opportunity to do anything about that, because there's a lot of economic disempowerment that goes along with this kind of cohesion. So, Egypt is an interesting place. And if you look at it over the very long duration of time, 5,000 years of time, which one can do, you can see that the Egyptians have been able to withstand a lot of really horrifying stuff, including being colonized for the last 2,000 years of its existence, maybe 2,600 years of its existence, and still maintain an Egyptianness that can resist in some way. That's an extraordinary thing. Everyone knows Egypt. Egypt is different from the rest of North Africa. If you talk to somebody from Europe and you say, what's the difference between Algerians and Tunisians? They would be like, don't know. What's the difference between Moroccans and Libyans? And maybe they'll know their geography and they'll be able to tell you which one's on the left, which one's on the right of their map. But Egypt, everyone knows. Egypt has always been able to differentiate itself in that way, and they're proud to have done so. It's like a weird, unique thing on our map that creates this weird, unique cultural expression still today.
Yeah, I wonder, when you were saying about the Nile being this cohesiveness to the community, would it in some ways dissipate a bit of the inequalities in that, when it floods and everybody benefits, everybody from the pharaoh to the lowliest slave benefits, and when it's a drought and everybody's affected from the highest to the lowest, and so their fates are sort of all tied in together with something that's out of their control equally.
No, it's the opposite. And I just wrote an article about this for a volume I have coming out with Routledge on Egyptian social history. And I co-edited this volume with two of my colleagues, Danny Candelora and Nadia Ben Marzouk. And I wrote the chapter on geography and how I think Egypt's Nile, while creating a cultural cohesiveness and continuity unlike anywhere else on the planet, also pushes for a social inequality, a continued social inequality, unlike anywhere else on the planet. And just to take two of the examples you brought up, you're like, the Nile erases all the boundaries, right? There's no plots of land that are discernible. It's all underneath the water. And then the water goes away. Then what happens? How do you determine whose plots are whose? Well, it works really well for the guy who's got the most people under his control to march through the land and to mark those plots and to say, these are mine and those are yours. And there's, over time, and farming comes to Egypt quite late, fifth millennium BCE, quite late in comparison to Anatolia, Fertile Crescent, Levant, things like that. But land ownership is quite limited in Egypt, and it is interestingly restricted, mostly, arguably, to larger institutions. Those institutions could be the king, they could be the harem of the king, they could be the temple, this temple or that temple. They could be the treasury of the god's wife of Amen, but there's a lot of institutional ownership. Yes, there are wealthy landowners, but those wealthy landowners are almost institutional in their, like being the Duke of Northumberland, right? You're almost institutional in your place in the world. So there's a lot more sharecropping of other people's land than there is squabbling over ownership of your own land, because you cannot draw the line. And when the line is redrawn, people throw up their hands. They're like, okay, fine, it's all the Amen temples and we'll farm it. You just keep us safe, okay? And because everyone's kind of drunk and full on cheap carbs, this will work. If everyone was like Hesiod, like trying to move the rocks and like, oh my God, are we going to make it next year? This is really tough. Then maybe there would be more internal competition, but there's not. People are pretty happy, it seems, over millennia to allow an institution to own that land if they are able to take proceeds from that land. And that, in my opinion, creates all kinds of unexpected things, such as more female power, less sexual control. If you don't have land ownership, you don't have to mark a woman's womb. You don't have to determine whether or not she's had sex with somebody. You don't have to even have marriage ceremonies and do these things in the way that you would in the Levant, in Greece or Rome. You don't have to veil your woman. You can, there's a lot more sexual freedom. There's even divorce that can be initiated by the woman in ancient Egypt. Why? Because people weren't squabbling over land. So it's a weird thing that this institutional ownership, on the one hand, you're like, that's unfair. There's huge social inequalities. True. But it also means that in terms of gender equity, there's a lot more parity than there are in other parts of the world. And it grants something from which we can learn, which is why Egypt is the only place in the ancient world where women became leaders of state, not as a queen or an empress or a dowager empress, but as king. And that in and of itself is it is unique and it is extraordinary. And then there was another thing, I remember the other thing. You're like, oh, everyone's made equal when there's a famine. By no means. Those who can get through the famine are those who have really nice boats of imported cedar that have been able to traverse this river and collect taxes and put those grains without getting spoiled or wet or moldy into storage areas that are also made of nice plastered structures that won't get wet or moldy or overrun with mice, such that when a drought or famine comes and the Nile floods too much or too little, there are places where grain is stored and people look communally. They're like, where is my community? Where is my leader? How can it's almost socialist if it's institutionally run, if you want to think of it that way. And Egyptians are very socialist in their understandings of equity and fairness as they work with each other. Elites know this too. Only recently have elites decided in Egypt en masse to move their houses out to the desert and not live amongst the poor people. They always used to live amongst the poor people. And there were ideas of how patronage needed to work that were strongly embedded in society. But the drought did not affect rich and poor equally. If all you have is a rush boat, what can you store? Your grain is going to spoil just putting in the boat. You can't collect anything, and you can't collect large amounts. You're not going to get your Joseph parable story about the 7 years of plenty and storing all that grain, right? You need organization. You need a communal interest in organization. You need people willingly giving up their grain to do that. So I have argued that this river, it creates a deep social inequality that actually creates a deep, and I didn't go this far in the article, but it is like a deep socialist sort of communal living environment. And the king, it's a heavy mantle. The king can be a populist like Ramses II. He can push back too hard like Senwosret III and try to overthrow his elites. But a king who does not do right within this system, there will be bad things written about him and he will be not remembered fondly. A king has to work with it, and the elites have to work within this system to make sure that all are fed and housed. This is a very Egyptian way of going about living in the world, much happier, gentler, puppies and rainbows sort of way of living in the world compared to an ancient Greek reality, for instance.
So you're saying that when there was famine, people would look to their communities, and those communities, centers, those institutions that would kind of run things would give them grain and keep people fed?
Yeah. I mean, there's not a whole lot of direct evidence of this until later periods, where you get a lot of, and in those later periods, when you get a Greek occupation, a colonial occupation coming into Egypt of a new elite, an elite replacement, particularly in the north, you see a lot of those systems of patronage being undermined, overturned, and a lot of people really upset. And so you'll get riots you can learn a lot by riots for bread in Alexandria about patronage and what is expected by what is not given. and what is not understood. So I would say that a lot of these colonial new elites who are coming in, including the Ptolemaic kings themselves, who don't understand the way things should necessarily work and do things in a Greek fashion, they do so at their peril, and they will have to work against a population that's like, I'm sorry, no, we're taking this into our own hands. And when you have more data for the way grain is stored and kept and moved and distributed and redistributed, you see a difference in Upper Egypt in the south versus Lower Egypt. And that's very interesting in and of itself.
Following riots and things like that, I know that like Cleopatra was, we know that she was a pretty good ruler because she didn't have riots, and it was recorded that people weren't doing uprising against her. And you were mentioning before that one of the reasons women could have so much power was part of this lack of land ownership. You've obviously written, you have written a whole book about this, like When Women Ruled the World, which is really, really fascinating. Could you maybe tell us a few more reasons why women were able to sort of reign supreme in ancient Egypt?
Yeah, it's and that's this book. I'll hold this one up. When Women Ruled the World. A sly title, because by the end I'm pretty clear in saying that they are placeholders for a larger patriarchy that they cannot change and they cannot control. There is no feminist discourse coming from these women's mouths. There cannot be. But the fact that they ruled it all is a very Egyptian thing. And it has, there are a number of features to it. I teach a class at UCLA called Women in Power in the Ancient World. And I compare Egypt to Greece, to Rome, to the Levant, to Mesopotamia, to China, to India, and to Persia. And when you look at these places, we start each section with a map. We look at cultural cohesion, political cohesion. We look at social inequality and land ownership and things like that. Egypt is the only place out of these where you see a regularized and systematic reach for female power. And yes, in this book, there are only 5 female kings, but that discounts the dozens of women who ruled as regents on behalf of sons too young to rule on their own. Any other place in the world, most of which I've just mentioned, like Greece or Rome or the Levant, Mesopotamia, if you put a boy on the throne who's 10 years old and you're like, oh, we worship him as God King, he'll be dead before the week is out as the warlords descend and they kill him. Whereas in Egypt, the elites are like, the new Horus is on the throne. Yes, we'll take it. And because the Egyptians believe so fervently in their divine kingship, but really it's because Egypt was geographically prone to being centralized and to not having internal squabbling nor external invasions geographically. Egypt was set up for a divine kingship par excellence, unlike anywhere else on the planet. And to maintain that divine kingship, you need women. You need powerful women, educated women, women who can stare down an official, women who can read and write. Those women, when their 8-year-old or 12-year-old becomes king, are the ones to whom people turn and they say, okay, what do we do next? What should the taxes be this year, my lady? And she'll make decisions. And then when the time comes, when her son is grown and she's educating him while she's ruling, she will then be able to step back into the shadows and let him have the game. 5 times in history, maybe more, a woman was not regent to her own son. There was a step removed, something happened. And those women were able to become king, sometimes alongside a son or a husband, in Nefertiti's case, Cleopatra's as well, for brothers and also her father. Depends on how you define kingship for Cleopatra, but I'll stand by it. I think it works. But the point is that here's the dirty underbelly of it. To maintain an authoritarian family dynasty, the women need to be there as ways of keeping the links in the chain connected. So if there is some sort of succession crisis, a woman can be used to try to maintain stability. You even see women ruling at the end of dynasties, like Neferu Sobek, the first documented female king. She rules at the end of the 12th dynasty alone, 3 or 4 years, not clear how long. The dynasty ends with her. she's called king. Why do people even allow that? They wouldn't allow it in any other part of the world, but she's the last woman standing from the dynasty, and they let her have it. And then they move on to the 13th dynasty after that. So it's an Egyptian way of keeping the status quo and keeping the warlording at bay. Egyptian women knew that they had to give more to their elites to gain power, that they had to be less violent vis-a-vis those elites. So for the elites, they're like, oh my God, there's crisis. Let's put a woman in power. It'll be great because we'll have that. Whether people are making these decisions cynically with this kind of strategy is unclear, or is it just people know that within this system, the way it works, the woman is going to be the thing that's going to get us from place A to place B, because she's going to rule in a certain way. There's all kinds of reasons why women are ruling the world in Egypt. They're absolutely essential, but the short answer is that it's to maintain a deeply social and equal authoritarian system. So you can make of that what you will. It's so ironic that where women get the most power is in the most deeply unequal of societies, and where there's more competition. Look at Greece. One man falls, another man's going to take his place, keep the woman in the house. We don't even need to talk about her. She is non-essential.
It's very interesting you have said that, because I'm living here in Argentina, and there's twice now within even just the last 50, 70 years where a woman has come to power to continue the legacy or dynasty of the political party of the man, Evita Peron and the Kirchners. Like even today, it still continues.
Looking at Rome is super useful in that capacity, because in Rome, women had so much soft power, and they were used as marriage tokens, as lovers, as connectors from one family to another, again and again, so much so that the Senate would decree a divorce and then decree a marriage between two families, because that worked well for everyone. But the women were absolutely essential to deep political intrigue and to all kinds of soft political power. But it's the power of the family. It doesn't have anything to do, women's power doesn't have anything to do within a patriarchy, that is, about which side you lean on, left or right. And when I vote, I take that into account. Some people are like, oh, I vote for all the women. I'm like, you're crazy.
Yeah, I mean, we do count for 50% of the population, so you can't really just say everybody belongs to one political party or another. A little bit more nuanced than that. Now, for people who kind of want to get into understanding ancient Egypt, would you be able to recommend a few of the best books to read with regards to either original texts and good books that can get somebody a bit more familiar with this whole vast, fascinating era of time?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite book that really will get people started is Barry Kemp's Ancient Egypt, Kemp, K-E-M-P, and it's Ancient Egypt, Anatomy of a Civilization. And I think it's on its 4th edition. And it's funny, he's taken out chapters and put in chapters. So if you get a used copy and you get a 2nd edition, you will not suffer. You'll actually get different chapters, wholly different chapters than you would in the new 4th edition that is updated. So that's a wonderful thing to start with, because Barry Kemp works with actual texts and actual evidence in translation in this book, but you're able to see what kind of data you have to work with. And as we know, Egypt is preservative. There's so much data, letters and workshop records and receipts and divorce documentation and legal texts and all kinds of written things. And then there's mud brick homes. There's even these tombs with all of the religious beliefs and funerary offerings still preserved in these places. The human bodies. There's so much data, and Barry Kemp works with all of that data to help you understand Egypt from the beginnings, pre-dynastic, to the late period. And I think that's a really good book to start with.
And if you were to pick an ancient text to be discovered in an Egyptian trash heap that they're still finding all sorts of cool things, what would you hope? Like at night you're praying, what ancient text can I find?
Oh my goodness. Right now I'm really, I've always taught Book of Earth, Book of Gates, Book of Heavenly Cow. I've taught them as you'll never be able to understand what the ancients were trying to communicate. These are exclusive texts. They're written in an exclusive way. These are secretive texts from secret societies. You can try to understand what it means that Osiris fell under the Abu tree, but you're not going to really get it because it's written in a purposefully confusing way. I think it would be really great to get some later, it would always be later, like initiatory texts that parse out some of these more secret and exclusive things. And maybe there's more sense to them than we give it. But so some of those texts they continue to intrigue me, even though I'm like, you guys, look at it socially, fly above the weeds, don't try to understand it. There's a part of me that really wants to know what the hell was going on. Is this based on stellar understandings? Is it based on a deep physical understanding of how the sun moves through the heavens? How scientific were some of these texts? Because the Egyptians, they're the ones who invent the 24-hour clock to track the sun through the hours of the day and night. How precise were these measurements? How much were they able to actually say, okay, well, this hour is going to be shorter because we're on this day in the winter, and so this daylight hour will be shorter, and then all the nighttime hours will get this much longer. I mean, how did they track stuff like that? So I'm starting to think a little more about the temple science that maybe wasn't understood as science per se, but understood as religious lore. I'd love to find some of that. There's so much secretive, exclusive information. Knowledge is power, and restricted knowledge is even more powerful. And they didn't write a lot of this stuff down. So, like I tell my students all the time, you're not going to get a blueprint for how the Great Pyramid was built. It is meant to be a miracle in stone. They're not going to tell you. It's like getting a blueprint for how to build a hydrogen bomb. No one's going to put that out there. No government's going to do that, because then somebody else could build it. So you keep that restricted knowledge. It's the same thing for a pyramid, which is nothing more than a weapon of the mind.
Beautifully said. And it is interesting. I've been talking about with a few other professors and such recently about the value of mystery, that there is something useful, powerful in that, and something that draws us to it and can inspire awe. And it's kind of like a lot of things with Homer. You're not necessarily supposed to find an answer. You're not necessarily supposed to know where the underworld is, these kind of things. But to finish up, because you've already been so generous with your time, can I ask you, what are you working on now? And where can we find you? Because I know you're very prolific, and you're on podcasts and Substack and all sorts of cool things. So I'd like to let everybody know where they can find you.
Yeah, sure. So I'm working on my book called Recycling for Death, and it's going to be published with American University in Cairo Press under my name, Kathleen M. Cooney, not my popular name of Kara Cooney. And that book will include a series of photo essays of body containers found in the Royal Cache Theban Tomb 320 at Deir el-Bahri and Kings Valley Tomb 35, and a couple of others. And these photo essays will do deep visual dives into coffin reuse and how you can track it. So that's the book. And that'll be coming out, she said, confidently at the end of 2022, I hope. It's almost fully written. I'm working on one of the last chapters, rewriting that right now, and we'll see. And it's got to go through peer review and all of this stuff. So, but I think we can try to move it out by end of 2022. And where to find me? The best place to find me is my podcast with Jordan Galzinski. That is on all of the podcast locations, Spotify, Apple Music or iTunes, and a lot of other podcast hosts. So you can look for us there. And we post probably about every 2 weeks, sometimes every week. And we have a lot to say, and we're very chatty. And we have lots of deep dives that we go down into, from how to get into graduate school and what's the university system like, to women in power in the ancient world. We also have a Substack. We've been working with Substack a lot lately, and The Substack is, so instead of posting things onto Facebook and you can't post on Instagram in this way or to Twitter, we collect everything that we're reading. And I say we because it's me, Jordan Galzinski, and Amber Wells. And we collect all of these articles. We write a little something about what it is that we're reading that week out in the interwebs or on paper. And we post about that every week. And so if you join our Substack and become a subscriber to that, you'll learn about all kinds of other stuff that we're up to. And all of these things get posted to my Facebook and my Twitter and Instagram. So I'm just putting them on different platforms now where I can have more freedom, more safety, less patriarchal body shaming myself and age shaming, that kind of thing. So I'm just putting my content in a place that gives me more of the community that I want to hang out with.
Well, I love that. We always have to find the right community. I like finding good, healthy, beautiful communities. And it's one of the things I like doing for the most part. The classics world, we have a very positive, I know for the classical wisdom crowd, everybody's just kind and enthusiastic and lovers of the ancient world. So I hope to encourage that and help bring some of our good, lovely classical lovers to you as well.
Oh no, I love it. Podcasts, and especially like a YouTube visual podcast, it helps to personalize and humanize things so much more than what social media has done. So we're not just yelling at other people from our cars.
Yeah. No, we do the positive stuff. I like that. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds.